The gold rush was not a dream. It was a death sentence for thousands, yet it is remembered as a shining beacon of opportunity, a story of grit, ambition, and discovery. But behind the golden legend lies something far darker. Imagine this. Inside the California gold rush of the 1800s, a man stumbles into Sacramento with nothing but a pickaxe and a dream. Within weeks, he's dead, overwhelmed by debt, disease, or dangerous conditions of a collapsing mine. Now multiply him by tens of thousands. That was the reality. These were the 49ers, gold seekers who rushed to California in 1849, chasing wealth after news of a gold strike spread across the world. The dream of instant wealth wasn't just a fantasy, it was a trap. And the reality of the gold rush dark history begins not with glittering rivers, but with desperate men sinking into mud, disease, and despair. They came from every corner of the world, drawn by whispers of gold, seduced by tales of riches that seemed just one pan away. But what they found was something else entirely. Archival records and personal diaries from the era revealed that most 49ers never found gold at all. Instead, they found price-gouging merchants, fraudulent land deeds, and a brutal survival lottery. According to historian Malcolm Rawbo, whose work is considered foundational, success stories were the exception, suffering was the rule. And yet, the myth endured, because someone was always making money, just not the miners. This documentary exploration is not about adventure. It's about gold rush greed and violence and the truth that history buried under layers of patriotic nostalgia and Hollywood fantasy. The real gold fever stories don't glitter, they rot. This hidden history is one of abandoned boomtowns, broken families, poisoned rivers, and forgotten gold rush stories. It's the tale of men lured to their ruin, of indigenous communities displaced in the name of progress, and of a country willing to sacrifice justice for the illusion of wealth. And if you think this is just a story from the past, think again. The same machinery of exploitation and illusion still exists today. We're just digging in different soil. More on that later. Tonight we'll reveal how it gave birth to American capitalism, not as a triumph, but as a massacre. This is how Gold Rush built America, not through unity, but through exploitation. We'll also answer the haunting question, was the gold rush worth it? Let us begin. The California gold rush didn't just displace people, it erased them. Before 1848, an estimated 150,000 Native Americans lived in what would become the state of California. Within just 20 years, that number would fall by over 80%. Some died from disease and starvation, but many were hunted. State records, often excluded from mainstream education, confirm what many still hesitate to name. This was systematic destruction, codified in law and incentivized by cash. In 1851, California's government openly authorized the formation of militias to conduct what they called punitive expeditions against native tribes, reimbursing settlers for ammunition and expenses. Soon, they escalated from skirmishes to full-scale extermination campaigns. According to historian Benjamin Madley, whose extensive research into this period reframed the academic consensus, California's elected officials not only tolerated forced removal, they funded it. Bounty laws offered payments for every indigenous scalp or severed head. Vigilante groups rode out not to protect settlements, but to clear land. And the motive was always the same: gold. Miners wanted unfettered access to rivers, valleys, and mountain trails, and the indigenous peoples who had lived there for centuries were deemed disposable. This wasn't some fringe violence. It was a state-backed strategy to free up land for settlers and investors. Entire villages were burned. Women and children were massacred. Survivors were enslaved under vague apprenticeship laws or sold to ranchers. Few lived to tell their stories. The gold rush indigenous impact was not a side effect. It was the foundation. The gold that built the cities of San Francisco and Sacramento was soaked in blood long before it was minted into coins. These atrocities weren't hidden. They were celebrated in newspapers of the time, which published scalp counts like stock reports. And yet in modern retellings, these facts are airbrushed out. We remember the 49ers, but not the Wintu. We name towns after pioneers, not after the tribes they displaced. This is what gold rush myths versus facts really means, a complete inversion of who we remember and who we erase. But the question remains, how could such horror be justified? What story did they tell themselves to believe this was right? The answer lies in the lawless chaos of the boomtowns, where justice was just another thing for sale. What happens when there are no rules, only gold? When courts are bribed, mobs hang on hearsay, and swift punishments are done over common disputes. In the next chapter, we go inside the brutal legal Wild West and see how justice died in the mines. In the world of gold rush boomtowns, law wasn't absent, it was auctioned. When thousands of fortune-hungry men poured into California, they didn't just bring shovels, they brought chaos. Mining camps sprang up overnight, full of strangers, greed, and rumors. But there were no courthouses, no police, and no constitution to hold it all together. So they made their own rules, and broke them just as fast. Gold rush frauds and scams weren't the exception, they were the economy. Fake gold claims were sold to newcomers who didn't yet know how to test the metal. Tools were tampered with, maps were forged, and land deeds were duplicated and sold to multiple buyers. Confidence men became millionaires, while the desperate were left digging in circles. According to primary sources from the time, justice was often dispensed not by judges, but by mobs. One wrong word, one accusation, and a man could be hanging from a tree before sunset. Vigilante committees operated as self-appointed courts, carrying out sentences without evidence or appeal. And sometimes those who called for order were the very same ones committing the crimes. A famous case from 1856 in San Francisco reveals the moral collapse of the system. James King of William, a prominent newspaper editor known for exposing political corruption, was gunned down in broad daylight. The killer, a political rival, expected the court to protect him, but the citizens, weary of corruption, formed their own tribunal, stormed the jail, and hanged him themselves. Applauded by many, this act set a precedent that justice belonged to whoever had the most gold, guns, or gall. And in this world, the poor had none of the above. Miners who struck gold often found themselves robbed by corrupt sheriffs or swindled by speculators. Chinese immigrants and Mexican workers had little legal recourse when cheated or attacked. Their testimonies were often inadmissible in court. In many counties, non-white witnesses were legally barred from testifying against white defendants. This wasn't lawlessness. It was law, weaponized. Facts about the gold rush often skip over this systemic rot. Popular culture romanticizes the Wild West as a place of honor duels and saloon justice. But the truth about the gold rush is that the scales of justice were rigged from the start. Courtrooms, when they existed, were not temples of fairness. They were stages for property disputes and bribes. Judges were often local businessmen with a stake in the outcome. Trials were rushed, sentences brutal, and appeals non-existent. This system didn't fail. It functioned exactly as intended, to protect capital and silence dissent. But if justice was broken, who kept the machine running? Who built the roads, mined the rivers, raised the towns, only to vanish from the history books? To find them, we need to look beyond the courtroom and into the labor that made the rush possible. Next, we uncover the erased workforce behind the dream, the enslaved, the excluded, the exploited, the people who dug the gold and paid the price. The legends speak of rugged white men striking gold in untamed wilderness. But that's only part of the story. The truth is, the gold rush true story begins with invisible hands, and most of them never saw a dollar. Chinese immigrants arrived in the thousands, fleeing war and famine, only to face crushing taxes and violence. The 1850 foreign miners' tax targeted them directly. When they succeeded anyway, they were attacked. Historian Su Cheng Chan describes them as indispensable and disposable, wanted for their labor, erased from the record. Indigenous survivors of massacres were forced into servitude under California's so-called Protection Act. African Americans, both free and enslaved, labored under threat, denied rights, and largely written out of the narrative. Mexican miners, who had been there before the rush, were suddenly foreigners, their claims stolen, their voices silenced. These groups built the camps, ran the kitchens, hauled the earth, and kept the gold rush boomtowns alive. But they were denied the wealth they helped create. And yet, while they built towns with their bare hands, their names were already being erased. Why? Because history wasn't written by the workers, it was written by the winners. This erasure wasn't incidental. It was narrative control, a myth designed to present the gold rush as a masculine triumph, a story cleaner and more patriotic than the messy truth of exploitation and exclusion. So who really got rich in the gold rush? Not the laborers, not the ones in the dirt. The real winners sold them shovels and silence. As we trace these lost stories, a new picture forms. The gold rush wasn't a frontier fantasy. It was a machine, one fueled by stolen land, stolen labor, and a national myth too convenient to question. And yet, through all of this, one group endured quietly on the margins. They didn't chase gold, they endured it. Next, we turn to the women of the gold rush, survivors of a different kind. The gold rush was a man's world, chaotic, lawless, and lethal. But in the shadows, women held up what little structure the frontier had. Without them, it would have crumbled. Life during the gold rush was brutal. In 1850s California, men outnumbered women by as much as 20 to 1. Most women didn't come for gold. They came to survive it. Some followed families, others arrived alone, lured by the promise of work. What they found was disorder. Towns with no protection, no systems, and no place for them in the heroic gold rush myth. But they adapted fast. Many opened boarding houses, bakeries, or laundries, work that often proved more stable than mining. A woman with a good pie recipe could out-earn a prospector in a day. According to local records, women ran vital services, cared for the sick, and created the social glue that kept communities from collapsing. Still, many lived under constant threat. Native women were abducted and forced into servitude. Chinese women were trafficked. African American and Mexican women were denied property rights and legal protection. Violence was common, and the law rarely intervened. Women in the gold rush weren't just supporting characters, they were survivors, builders, and silent witnesses to the dream's collapse. A few, like Mary Ellen Pleasant, a formerly enslaved woman who became a powerful abolitionist and business owner, left a mark. Most did not. Their stories were buried under the same ground that miners tore apart. According to historians, this erasure was no accident. It was part of a larger narrative designed to present the gold rush as a masculine conquest, not a complex human disaster. The hidden history of the gold rush is filled with female labor, sacrifice, and loss. And though their voices were silenced, the emotional weight of their presence remains, a quiet truth beneath the noise of the rush. But while some endured quietly, others, mostly men, were consumed, not by gold but by something deeper, a madness that tore apart minds, families, and whole communities. Next, what happened when the dream became obsession? When men abandoned everything chasing wealth that never came? In the next chapter, we descend into the psychological collapse they called gold fever. If you've made it this far, you probably sense it too, that history isn't what we were told. It's not just dates and dusty names. It's struggle. It's silence. Subscribe, like, and share this journey. Because the real story of the gold rush is just the beginning, and there's so much more history still hidden in the dark. When the fever turned to madness, at first they called it ambition, then destiny. But as the gold veins dried up, something darker emerged, not a rush, but a collapse. A sickness they called gold fever. Men arrived hopeful. They left paranoid, violent, or vanished. Diaries speak of friends turning on each other, of men digging through the night, convinced they were inches from salvation. One miner wrote, "I only sleep when I fall down." It wasn't metaphor. It was collective collapse. Modern psychology might call it addiction, an endless chase for reward, no matter the odds. And in the gold rush, gold fever camps, the chase never stopped. The more they lost, the deeper they dug. The madness became collective. Families were abandoned, letters home ceased. Some walked into rivers and never returned. Violence spiked, despair levels escalated. Newspapers described a moral rot spreading through the camps. Anthropologists suggest the emotional damage went beyond the individual. Whole communities fractured. Hope became a kind of poison. And through it all, others profited, land speculators, merchants, bankers who never lifted a shovel. Because what is gold fever really? A system built to weaponize desire. The collapse of sanity wasn't failure, it was fuel. The real gold rush stories weren't just about death, they were about what people were willing to lose or become to keep the dream alive. But when the fever burned out and the digging finally stopped, something else was left behind. Not gold, but silence. All across California, the towns that rose overnight began to vanish just as fast, leaving behind only foundations, bones, and whispers. When the gold dried up, the silence was deafening. The same towns that once roared with ambition, filled with shouts, gunfire, and the clang of pickaxes, became cemeteries without caretakers. Across California, hundreds of once booming settlements vanished almost overnight. Their names have faded, their buildings collapsed, but their foundations remain, buried under dust and weeds. These are the gold rush ghost towns, and their stories are not just relics, they're warnings. From Body to Calico, from Whiskey Town to Empire City, these places boomed, burst, and died in the span of a single human life. Collapse of gold rush towns wasn't an accident. It was built into the very system. Towns existed only as long as the gold lasted. When the veins dried up, or a better strike was rumored elsewhere, entire populations vanished like smoke. But they didn't always leave cleanly. Abandoned burial sites, tools, child-sized coffins, and hastily scrawled journals are all that remain in some of these places. According to local historians and forensic archaeologists, many sites reveal signs of epidemics. Cholera, dysentery, and starvation, outbreaks that tore through malnourished, overworked communities without medical care or sanitation. Some towns were buried deliberately, torched in panic, or burned for insurance fraud. Others were swallowed by nature, reclaimed by forest or desert. But in nearly all of them, one thing remains constant. No one bothered to return. There was no mourning, no preservation. These towns died with no eulogy. And yet some say they never fully died. Legends linger, locals whisper of real gold rush dark stories, footsteps in abandoned mines, lantern lights moving where no living person walks, children's laughter in ruined schools. Whether ghost stories or trauma echoing through time, these accounts speak to something unresolved. A haunting not just of place, but of memory. Because what really died in those towns wasn't just the people, it was the promise. Gold fever stories sold the idea of progress, that hardship would lead to prosperity, but the bones beneath the floorboards tell a different tale. They tell of cycles of hope and abandonment, of communities that never had a future because they were never meant to last. These weren't cities, they were extraction sites with post offices. And today, many of their names have been repurposed, sold as tourist attractions, haunted experiences, or themed casinos. Their histories edited down to quirky anecdotes, their graves unmarked. This is the final irony of the gold rush myths versus reality. Even the ruins have been commodified. But there's one more piece to this puzzle, because while thousands chased gold and died trying, there was a group who never touched a shovel and got unimaginably rich. They sold the tools, they sold the land, they sold the dream. In the next chapter, we reveal the real winners of the gold rush and how they built the foundations of modern American capitalism without ever setting foot in a mine. The miners dug, the dreamers died. But the richest men of the gold rush, they never dirtied their hands. From the very beginning, the rush wasn't just about gold, it was about the idea of gold, and those who understood that made fortunes not by chasing the metal, but by feeding the frenzy. They didn't mine rivers, they mined people. Take Levi Strauss. He didn't strike a claim or pawn for nuggets. He sold durable trousers to miners who wore through clothing in weeks. His business exploded. Or Leland Stanford, a grocer turned railroad tycoon, who parlayed gold rush profits into political power and industrial dominance. These were the men who understood the true economy of the rush. Not extraction, but speculation, supply, and control. According to economic historians, fewer than 5% of miners ever turned a real profit. Most lost everything. But the infrastructure around them, the merchants, bankers, landowners, thrived. Town plots were sold at inflated prices, mining tools were marked up tenfold, water rights were monopolized and resold. Even the newspapers became tools of profit, pushing tales of new discoveries to drive traffic and spending. This is the truth behind the phrase, who got rich in the gold rush? Not the miners, not the laborers. The ones who got rich sold the fantasy. And when the gold ran out, they reinvested in railroads, banks, and industry. They built the next empire, while the miners faded into ghost towns. This isn't just irony, it's structure. The gold rush explained a new model of capitalism, one in which profit comes not from production, but from controlling the conditions around it. Merchants didn't need to gamble, and they needed to wait for desperation to turn into dependency. And in many ways, that model survives. Today, the tech entrepreneurs, the hedge funds, the real estate developers, they too rarely dig. They profit from speculation, infrastructure, and the packaging of dreams. They sell the tools of the next rush, whether it's crypto, AI, or oil. The mechanics are eerily familiar. The truth about the gold rush is that it wasn't just a historical moment, it was a blueprint. A story about how wealth is created, who pays the cost, and who writes the legacy. Because history remembers the dreamers who struck gold, but quietly forgets the ones who sold them the shovel and walked away millionaires. But the story doesn't end with the last nugget. The hunger never left. In our final chapter, we follow the echo of the rush into modern obsessions, new frontiers, and a system that still glitters while it devours. The gold is gone. The rivers have long since dried up or been poisoned. The mining camps are nothing but splinters and dust. And yet the fever remains. And if you think we have left the hunger behind, think again. Because the gold rush was never truly about gold. It was about hunger, for wealth, for status, for the promise of transformation overnight. And that hunger did not die with the boomtowns. It simply found new soil. Today we chase cryptocurrencies, stock market bubbles, speculative real estate. We dream of overnight riches from startups, social media virality, lottery jackpots. The prizes look different, but the machinery is the same. Sell the dream, blur the risks, bury the consequences. How the gold rush changed the world is not just through railroads and migration, but through the invention of a mentality, a willingness to gamble lives, lands, and futures on a rumor of wealth, a faith that the next big strike is just around the corner, no matter the cost. And just as in 1849, the true fortunes are rarely made by the ones who rush in. They are made by those who control the infrastructure, the platforms, the markets, the tools. Those who sell the dream while insulating themselves from the collapse. Economic historians argue that the gold rush laid the psychological foundation for modern capitalism. Speculation over stability, extraction over stewardship, short-term gain over long-term survival. This is why hidden history of the gold rush matters, because it was not just a chapter in America's past, it was the beginning of its most enduring myths. The real gold rush stories were never about caves caving in or bandits in the hills. They were about what ambition, untethered from reality, can do to entire societies, about how quickly dreams can turn predatory, and the environmental scars left behind, the mercury still leaking into California's rivers, the flattened mountains, are not just physical wounds. They are reminders that the rush is never clean, never free, never without victims. So the next time a new boom appears on the horizon, glittering and golden, it is worth remembering. The system was never designed to make most people rich. It was designed to make most people chase. Because in the end, the gold rush was not a dream fulfilled. It was a dream sold. And the hunger it unleashed still shapes the world we live in. If uncovering the real story behind the gold rush changed how you see history, consider subscribing to the channel. We explore the buried truths, the forgotten victims, and the uncomfortable realities that history often tries to hide. The rivers have stopped singing, the mines have fallen silent, but listen closely and you can still hear it. The hunger, the promises whispered through time, promising riches, change, salvation. The gold rush never ended. It simply evolved. finding new veins in human ambition, new mountains to flatten, new dreams to sell. The story we are told of brave pioneers carving a nation from wilderness leaves out the graves, the betrayals, the poisoned earth. But those ghosts still walk with us. Every boomtown built on illusion, every bus littered with broken lives, every system that trades futures for fortunes. The story of the gold rush is not a closed chapter, it is a mirror. One we are still standing in front of. And maybe if we look closely enough, we will stop asking, who got rich? And start asking, who paid the price? Because the hunger glitters, the hunger consumes, and it never, ever sleeps. If the story of the gold rush feels heavy, it should. But the conflict didn't start with miners. It began long before 1849, with the systematic erasure of indigenous nations across the continent. In our documentary on the dark history of Native America, we uncovered how centuries of broken treaties, forced removals, and brutal assimilation campaigns paved the way for events like the gold rush. This wasn't a one-time horror. It was part of a pattern. If you want to understand how the land was already soaked in blood before the first nugget was found, that episode is essential. Watch it next. The ghosts are still speaking. Good night.